My name is Pallavi Banerjee, and I am an assistant professor of sociology at the University of Calgary. My special courses are on immigration and families, or sexuality and families, globalization and families, and I also teach courses on methods and theory. Ethnography is a qualitative research method where you immerse yourself in the social setting that you're studying. So one of the ways that I did it is by immersing myself in the communities of the families that I was studying. So I was sort of eating with them, going to social events with them, cooking with them. So this is part of ethnographic research methods. And what it does is it gives you an insight, a deep insight into lives of the people that you are researching. Intersectionality is then a way of understanding the multiplicative accesses of domination and oppression that a person or a group experiences because of their social location vis-a-vis their social identities. And what that really means is that your gender, your race, your class, your national identity, your citizenship identities, these are identities that inform how the society interacts with you and what you have access to and what you don't have access to, right? It defines your privileges or your disadvantages. So understanding this as a whole is what intersectionality is. Now I'm going to tell a story about one of my major research projects that gave me new insights into families because of using intersectionality as a lens. So I use intersectionality as a lens to understand the social world, right? I use it as an epistemology instead of a theory. So this project is about families of Indian immigrants that come into the United States on skilled workers visas, right, as skilled workers. And there are two families in particular that I looked at, two family forms. In one, where high-tech workers who come into the United States on high-skilled visas, and they bring their spouses on a certain kind of visa, which is popularly known as dependent visas. And then I looked at another set of families where the main migrant was a woman, the nurses, who come in also on high-skilled visas and bring their spouses, husbands, on this dependent visa. What the dependent visa does is that it allows the high-tech workers who come to the United States as temporary workers to bring in their spouses and their families. But what it also does is that it disallows the spouses of the high-tech workers from working or having any form of identity beyond the working spouses while they are in the United States. And the period that they are in the United States can range anywhere between 6 to 20 years. It's mostly on the higher end of the spectrum, so usually, it's anywhere between 6 to 15 years. So then what we have are two sets of families where the spouse, in one case women, and in another case the man, is a legal dependent for a period of 6 to 15 years. So my research question was, what does this kind of policy do for and to the families? So in the families of the high-tech workers, where the men were the breadwinners and the women were the dependents, the women were taking on housewifely roles where they were doing all of the housework, all of the childcare work, but they were doing more than they needed to, right? They were spending an enormous amount of time just doing housework. They were decorating the house, they were cooking elaborate meals. And when I asked them why they were doing it, the one-word answer was because they are bored out of their minds, right? Because these were all professional women who were working in India. Often they had better jobs than their spouses, right? And then they come to the United States and they come on these visas and they are relegated to a position of a legal dependent, not only a legal dependent, but a dependent that has no identity beyond their husbands. So that was a big blow on their identity. And the way that they were coping is trying to be the best housewife ever. In the families of the nurses, what was happening was even more interesting. So the families of most of the nurses and their families that migrated were from a particular part of India, but they were also all Christians, right? So they came and they usually found residence where they lived was around their churches, their ethnic churches. So a lot of the nurses lived in the same neighborhood. So when I was doing my ethnography, what I found was that the men in these families were very involved in their churches. But what was going within the families was interesting in the sense that you would assume that the nurses were in full-time jobs. They were often doing multiple shifts. But what I found was that they were also doing most of the housework. They were doing most of the childcare work. Well, the men were doing childcare work, but the women were doing part of the childcare work as much as they could. The reason for this was so that the men did not feel insecure in their masculinity, because what happens with dependence for the men is that their masculinity is in question, a kind of masculinity that they learned in their patriarchal, religio-patriarchal societies, and in the society generally, is that men must provide. And suddenly they were relegated to a position of a legal dependent with no identity of their own beyond their spouse. So they felt very insecure about their masculinity. And not only did they feel insecure about their masculinity, their family members also felt that their masculinity needed to be reasserted. So the women were often saying that, well, I earn, but my husband is still the head of the household. And the men were often saying, I am the sacrificial father of the husband. I took on this position because I wanted to provide for my family and to keep my family safe. So the narrative was one of reclaiming masculinity by reclaiming this position of power within the family. But what was also happening is they were taking care of their children, right? So there was some gender variation or undoing of gender, as we call in sociology, that was happening in these families. But given that the class location of the nurses was slightly different from the high-tech workers, because the husbands of the nurses were in the first place not as qualified as the wives of the high-tech workers. The way that these families were doing gender was informed by their class, right? Because they did not have the class position, neither did they have the gender position at this point, the men. So the entire family came together to reassert that their position in not only the family but the society. If I had not used an intersectionality lens to approach my research, I would come out with a story about gender, a very simplistic story about gender, that women take on housewifely roles, the men reassert their masculinity, without talking about any of the complexity that goes on in making these families experience what they were experiencing.